Okay.
Thank you for joining us today. My name is Allison Van, and I'm the Executive Director at SPARC, a Center for Social Research Innovation. Welcome to today's SPARC Talk, Inclusive by Design, Translating Data Feminism for Policy with Priya Kumar. I'd like us to begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us and to recognize our responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. Priya Kumar has been at Global Affairs Canada since 2019, specializing in foreign policy issues at the intersection of digital technology, gender, and human rights. This includes thinking through new data methods and technical approaches that may be better suited for today's complex digital threats to democracy, including online hate, disinformation, and evolving gender-based violence, just to name a few. Priya serves as Professor of Practice in the Master of Public Policy and Digital Society program here at McMaster. Thank you so much for joining us, Priya.
Thank you. So first of all, I want to thank everybody that's on the line. This is going to be the beginning of a broader discussion around inclusive design, what that means, and all of those things. We will be giving out these slides after the presentation. So I'm just going through the whole thing. Things are moving by themselves. So I'm going to be giving you these slides as kind of an after package, okay? And the aim of it is going to be to kind of work with these principles. Now, I've tried to make this a bit interactive, and some just housekeeping issues is that there will be links that we're going to provide as we talk out some points. The other thing is that Data Feminism, the book, is accessible and available, and it's something that you can just search up right now. And I think a really important thing that we're going to be deconstructing and thinking about, and on the right-hand side of the screen, you see these bubbles or these circles, is really thinking about translating evidence to impact. And not only thinking about your intentions, but really thinking about a cycle of impacts, right? And I often use this hashtag thick data. I use that because I want to think about data in the context of that humanistic condition, or linking to the geographic. That's because at Global Affairs Canada, of course, I'm having to look externally and thinking about ways that we can meet communities and also work with my colleagues. 40% of our staff is outside of the country. So it means always kind of thinking about those different layers. One thing I do want to do before I begin is give a shout out, first of all, to everybody here, as well as the students that I've worked with in the last year, both at McMaster University and Global Affairs Canada through our Data Co program. They have tested many of these products that I'm going to show, approaches. They're the ones that asked about how do we do inclusive data analysis. Also the data community, that means people that are researching this intersection between human rights and implications, as well as in government spaces and universities. There are always those side of desk folks that are really thinking about culture change in more emotional ways or expressive ways and looking at things a bit horizontally. I think it's really important to acknowledge those communities that have been there before we had these terms. So I just want to make sure that that's something that we recognize. I wish we had the time to do other introductions, but I hope that if we do, we're going to have some pauses that if you do have a question, just introduce yourself and we can chat it out. That's really important for this to be successful. Just very briefly, the plan. We've already checked part one. I've introed myself. I want to situate the problems and even the shared goals and challenges that we have, whether it be working in government, whether it be in research as a practitioner, It doesn't matter. We're really looking at the ways in which we engage with technology and culture today. Then I'm going to think about redesigning the whole process of, let's say, planning out research or engaging with gender-based analyses and what that means. And then thinking about redesigning our outcomes. What does success look like if we were going to engage with more feminist approaches? After that, I want to get into that actual principles of data feminism. And I just want to say that I do take a design justice approach where I don't ever call myself an expert. Rather, I'm perhaps facilitating this discussion, and I hope that we can all work together. And that also leads into what thick data means and taking more of that humanistic perspective of context, weaving into some of the work that I've been looking at extending how we sense data and really what that means in terms of expressive emotions. If we have some time, it'd be really cool to continue the discussion with some of the examples that I'm going to provide. And I do hope that we can keep in contact as we continue to flesh this out more. So some of you may have seen some of these slides. Like I said, different communities across government have been already part of this. And if some of you are interested, you can also maybe use the chat function. But ask yourself generally what the problem is, right? So, you know, we might not see products start to finish, devices. We talk a lot about data, but do we really think about the devices through which we make decisions with? You know, who designs that? I think we can take a guess that, you know, there is a majority of folks that might not have agency in that discussion. And maybe we step into environments that might already have their power relations and even groupthink that maybe we are also in the process of unlearning. So this is important. So we already know, in anybody that's working in the digital inclusion space will already know that you know, we've acknowledged that there is AI bias. You know, that's not something new. But, you know, when you think about your day-to-day habits when it comes to data, just ask yourself for a second, you know, what are the mediums through which you're engaging with data? What is data anyway? This was a really interesting question because many people didn't view text as data, right? They often thought, at least in practice, that data only reflects numbers. Okay. Does anybody have anything to say right at this point of what data you use, or do you want to save that for later? Okay, we'll save it for later. Sounds good. Okay, so any organization, whether it be the private sector or the public sector, what we have found in data culture, so it's a different type of thinking, that there are, in some ways, these shared goals and challenges. Also thinking about how we start to integrate aging populations, right? So we're always looking at young people, or we're always looking, at least in my work, at different countries in geopolitical contexts without thinking about our own you know, cultural realities. So some of the work that we did in the past was that of looking at these icebergs. That's what we theorize this as, that there is, you know, biases that might be baked into a dashboard that you use to make decisions. There's been a lot of literature, obviously, on how minorities are disproportionately impacted. And I think by and large, what we find is that how to become culturally responsive versus reactive sometimes is a bit challenging, right? It depends on the type of work you do, but to situate or justify maybe rejigging things, sometimes it's a bit challenging to see that scope when you're confronted with an iceberg, right? On the bottom left, the image is about, you know, again, the idea of inputs might not always translate to outputs, and we don't really know what explains decisions. And that's where that space, and some of you on the line, we've already talked about this in different fora, that we find that multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, mixed teams, it's not only this normative thing, it actually helps to stir up ideas, right? Because something that I think might jog your memory, and then we come up with something else. The methods and the technique that you do, that also matters. And this is something that I think for people from social sciences and humanities, this includes qualitative methods, even gender evaluation, for example. These types of mixed teams would be something, if you were looking to do something innovative, to get those types of communities that traditionally may be siloed. And then your outcome is also a bit more collaborative. So this cartoon here, this is a data viz. This came out of a 6-month activity that we did at Global Affairs Canada with community members through different consultations and focus groups of deconstructing and thinking about what inclusive data would mean. So when you're redesigning your outcomes, you're also keeping some space to think about, you know, what could be, what is missing. There are some people that might look at DNA of culture change or different models, but ultimately what we found is that many of the student population were really focused on issues and topics related to the impact of being misrepresented and you know, thinking about exclusion, right? Exclusion running in tandem with inclusion. And so this is something that I've been thinking about. And also one of the interesting points that came out with data analysis and what it means to work to be more inclusive is to be able to talk about bias openly. So one of the challenges still remains fostering or changing or shifting that climate in the room. So when you think about redesigning your outcomes, I think this between policy or making decisions and anything related to data or evidence, the ideas of what your outcomes are, that's something from the very beginning that has to be sorted, right? Or at least addressed. And what I mean by that is thinking about the methods or the way that things normally happen in your environment, that you enter that space. Second, coming up with potential possibilities. Okay, so rejigging or doing a few detours to see what could be possible. Okay, that might mean that you have to think about an 80-20% rate of success, or that there's no absolute type of failure, because right now we're just thinking about ideas, we're engaging with concepts. And so the cartoon was I think really useful because it allowed for the communication of emotions while still maintaining a sense of privacy and anonymity for communities that have historically been poked and prodded. And what we find is when we engage and we communicate and we listen to many populations that, you know, they don't have that sense of trust in any kind of decision making because they haven't necessarily been asked what they see or what ends up being the most impactful, like being misrepresented, right? And so I think for me, my emphasis in this point is being critical with those cycles, right? So one thing that we have done in some of our work, and we can talk this out after, is redesigning how you would go about something. So rather than having, you know, an end of a month deliverable, perhaps you redesign your outcome, that you break it up into 4 digestible sessions or bits or products, such that you have a little bit more, circulation of the ideas, but then also you might be able to be more precise in the way that you're looking to deliver something, right? And I'll give you some examples of that more concretely in a bit. Okay, so this is just a little wee bit of a pause break. And what I mean by that is I would invite you to get a hold of a copy of the 7 principles of data feminism. I've done most of the talking here. And so what I do also want to say is that I will be sending over a 1-pager of even some GBAPlus evidence in terms of what you want to think about or scenarios, because there is a lot of really rich material online as well. So gender-based analyses will be important for you to think about. We just don't have the time to go through that, but I would encourage some people that if you wanted to speak on the line at this moment, about anything to do with some of the questions that, or if you have any questions, now would be the time, and then we'll shift gears into actually going through the principles. I will also potentially call upon some people, and I'm looking at Nasreen, sorry. Okay, so what we will do is that we'll go through the model here. So this is as an accessible infographic. It comes in multiple languages. This is the French version. So the link is presented below there. And this is an artist illustration. So this is something that if you wanted to have a look and go through and think about the different principles and how they may relate to your work, okay? So the main point of even thinking about this type of framework and this model is to really examine the horizontal, or at least from my position here, is to think about the technocultural layers, okay? So an example of this would be thinking about deep fakes. Now, on one hand, we can look at synthetic media as threats to democracy, which they are. However, if we're looking around 80 to 90%, at least 90% being sexual violence, surely there are other questions related to decision-making models that haven't necessarily been asked, right? So essentially, when it comes to data feminism, I think the important point here is to understand and accept that many of the technological systems or data or evidence, when you think about how things are structured, organized, or categorized, there is something in the background that we don't have agency over. And so we just accept that, and that allows us to shift our focus and also be a bit more interactive with how we think about power, systems, and decisions and impact, okay? So this is a walkthrough document that our students have worked with. And when we do walkthroughs in the policy environment, we're working often with people that are not coming from a data background, right? So the best way to often relate is through journeys or experiences that everyday people may be able to connect with. And so that is, if you're going to pull over, you're doing a road trip, you still kind of have to figure out how you're going to get back and not lose your way. And it's the same type of way, at least what we find in global affairs across trade, development, and security lanes, that really we end up using everyday metaphors and examples, which is actually more challenging sometimes, right? So this is something that just to keep in mind. And I think one of the points, at least from the end of any of the work on racialized communities, if we're looking at anything to do with, let's say, disinformation in global South context, or really looking at localized context, one of the challenges with gender-based analyses is that plus, right? How do we confront or think about intersectionality? I mean, there's so many different patterns that we could think about. And so really, focusing more on the system rather than the unit of what we think, flipping it and thinking about power, even cultural gatekeeping in a room, who's there. That's thick data. Also acknowledging different modes of expertise, right? So we can look at our grandparents and the type of expertise that grandmothers have, and where is that knowledge situated, and how do we learn from that? So it is a challenging space that we have. Okay, so principle 1 and principle 2 are about power. And I know that becomes something that is a bit abstract, right? But I think the main point is to really think about who, like data science by whom, right? So who has that lead pen, for whom or what, right? Whose interest, right? And are we communicating? And that includes listening when it comes to evidence. Listening is something that also has been used even in more creative social research methodologies, and like drawing and these types of things. So that's something that I find super interesting. We can, if you have questions about it, we can ask. So these are examples from the book, page 80 there. As well as on the right-hand side on the top, I think surveys are often really indicative. If you look at historical surveys, you'll see a lot of decisions that are made, or at least we step into traditional modes, or there's evidence in which categories are made, and then you make a selection. Okay. The other point that becomes really, really integral in this idea of how do we examine and challenge power is to think about injecting different perspectives, counter perspectives. I know in the literature, they'll talk about counter public, so, Twitter communities, that sort of thing. However, what you do also see that even in the Wikipedia space, there's been acknowledgement of the gaps in terms of representation of women. And so what you see here, this is an example from the book where they had a Make the Breast Pump Not Suck hackathon. So again, it's putting the agency and putting that, who's going to use this tool most likely, right? Putting it there, making decisions. Maybe there are things that we're missing from different communities, that sort of thing. Are there any questions? Okay. Okay. So here's another example I think is really important because, and the book is on the left-hand side, it's called Living in Data. And I think that these are useful examples because again, it's about that scope or depth in the decisions of the environments, right? So we may take a cruise, but there are decisions that are made well before maybe we were ever born, right? So I encourage you to, and we can talk about this afterwards, to delve into more of like human geography or critical geography that will look at that human relation and doesn't necessarily focus on, these types of things, because there's way more data out there. On the right-hand side, I think that this is a really interesting data because it shows you how much emphasis we may place on like modeling how we do something, and maybe there are baked-in biases in some of the things we read or think about that we're not critically maybe looking at products the way that we ought to. Okay, so this one here, principle 3, is about elevating your emotion and embodiment. So this is a really interesting principle because I think sometimes we're only finally recently becoming comfortable with emotions, or at least understanding or accepting that emotions and expression has always been political, has always been part of our culture. And that maybe there are connections between what's here and here. And I say this as somebody that explores a lot of neurodivergent ways of thinking and sensing data, which is what I would like to talk about after, right? So that connection is not a bad thing. Now, in that old school data where it's just about numbers, this wouldn't exist, right? Because it would be then biased. However, what we're trying to do is right now, again, put the agency back into the human or the researcher, or at least acknowledging again that impact matters probably more than intention sometimes, right? Now, this is from some work that I did around text analyses and political discourse. And one of the things that we often think about in text analyses is that of the power of words and communication. And so here are some just broad questions that I find sometimes help to resituate back into the principles of that of, what were the conditions? Politics can happen anywhere and everywhere. So where are we looking, right? And also, I think the really important point is that if we're thinking about impact or thinking about cycles, after, what happened after? Because remember, we enter environments, right? So we have all these things that we have to experience. I put this activity that I'm working on right now as a hashtag hunt, and I've been working a fair bit on women's art, especially in the Twitter space, because there's been a lot of research on protests and women, but I think that we haven't done enough work on really how there might be these counter spaces for different types of expression. So I'm just putting that out there. On the bottom as well, the idea that language has always been a semantic information space, like policy is semantic, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, is really important, because what is hate speech? I mean, when we talk about disinformation, conspiracy theories, and anti-Semitism, what are those? I mean, there could be one single message, and yet they would go to very different spaces and places and have very different, could arguably have multiple impacts, right? So just thinking that out a bit more. On the right-hand side, and one of the examples that is mentioned in data feminism is that of, I think it was some cat suit or something like that that Serena Williams wore for some, there was a medical reason. And just talking about fairness, right? And the word fairness and how that manifests with systems, right? Because if systems, and if we accept anti-racism as a principle, then what is fairness, right? And so there's a lot of discourse around sexism. And I think the interesting point here is where are you looking? Where do the politics take place? Is that if you're going to do some work around gender discourse, let's say, right? In this case, you want to think about which publication or which media are framing, let's say, the situation. That's something that we look at in media discourse. How are women described? Who is pretty, who is strong? And that's something when you think about binary, in addition to gender, it's also about good and bad, right and wrong, dainty and super strong. And like these types of metaphors are something that we see that there are these counter spaces that are massaging different ways of being and thinking. Okay, so like I just mentioned, rethinking binaries and hierarchies. I think one of the challenges with hierarchies is that they exist everywhere and we might not even see them. One of the things that I try to do with even these types of presentations is humanize hierarchies. Just as much as I'm a policy person, I am also a woman of color in Canada. So the reality is that I really appreciate vulnerable leadership, right? So that means for me, it's just rethinking even how if you drop something, where is it going to go, right? Embracing pluralism is acknowledging groupthink and what the dominant way of doing something may be, and what could happen if we tried something a bit different. So this is a really famous art exhibition by Chris Buck. It was profiled in Oprah magazine in 2017. But I think it's something that allows me to describe rethinking hierarchy in a really kind of maybe something that I understand because I was that girl, right? So I think that ultimately, like these types of examples, what you start to see is that this, photography has always been a type of data that could be used in a way to provoke discussions or at least highlight the world in which we operate in, right? And so one of the interesting things with this exhibition was that of what happened after. I mean, that's something that you could also look at of, how does the public respond if you're looking at discourse or multiculturalism or whatever it may be. Okay, so principle 6 is consider context. That's a big word, right? It's a very abstract word. So I think for me, one of the ways is to think about that image of people, of how things are designed, and also which perspectives we might take a guesstimate at most often dominating. Just thinking about that. Then thinking about, and I'm using diversity, equity, and inclusion because those are government spaces and language that we operate in, but it's those middle points that start to matter. And they're really hard to get at right? Because you have to know the community in order to even get there. And the community also has to believe in what you're doing as well. So the main point though is when you collaborate, you're able to acknowledge and respect difference. You can combine. And I think that there's an interesting question of what gets measured matters, and how do you come up with measurements for feelings, right? That's where your lived experience. So one of the things in gender-based analyses is acknowledging lived experience, but that's really challenging to translate, right? So how do we confront or think about systems and the institutions, facts and opinions? I mean, look at a textbook from 30 years ago to today, right? So you're thinking about that. All of the things in the climate that you operate in end up being really important when it comes to trying to be more inclusive by design. So delivering on any form of culture change, and this is the type of work that I work on across our department and with the students, is really thinking about those gaps. When it comes to research, often in the social sciences, it can be on how can we use methods to show inconsistencies and imbalances more concretely, more precisely. So sometimes if you're doing case study work, that can help you, because you don't necessarily have to set one linear goal. Rather, you're looking at the nuances between. Okay, so this is an example of a project that I worked on where I was looking at, again, text analyses and representations of identity, and how we can, these are UN statements, how we can look at words and deconstruct and think about strategy, language. But to me, it's also about looking at the burden on which we put on, let's say, in this case, women. So for this work, I have 1979, the first convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. So at that time, a lot of the language focused around discrimination. Okay, so if we want to talk about this after, if you have questions, I'm happy to share the presentation of that. But the rhetoric and the language was situated in a different time. In 1995, that's the Beijing Declaration, call to action, that's significant. And then in the 2000 piece is the Women and Peace and Security Resolution. This is about women's agency and security and conflict, and is a resolution that we think about even today, about that link between development and democracy. Right? So this is something of what's the agency of women in conflict. And in 2018, and this was a resolution that I was involved with doing some research on accelerating efforts to eliminate violence against women and girls in digital contexts. So if we compare that to gender, there is a big difference, right? There is a big difference. And what you find, at least for my line of work, but I think many of you, depending on the stakeholder or group or person or book you're reading, people use different words. And what we find here, and I'll go back again, is there's a big difference. So, you ask yourself the evolution of these terms. And what does gender represent? We often, the first thing you'll say is that it's not really, like sex and gender are two different things. But I think that there's something here to be said. Now, one thing that you could do is you could use this as a baseline. And that's an important point, is that you're always fleshing out ideas. You're never really finished. This was a tool for me to facilitate discussion. Some people might stop there at the analyses, but that's not an inclusive analysis. The important point would be maybe to use this piece to cultivate discussion and think about what is the difference between women and gender in this case. What we find is that different countries, of course, might have different positions on we want to use women and girls versus gender. Okay. So now we're going to go a little bit more into the weeds discovery. And I want to just talk a bit about this thick data metaphor, or this term that I've been using. Thick data, it comes from anthropology, a thick description in your situated knowledge, but it also is really focused on relationships between, let's say, numbers. and also the context around you. So on the top, I have 2 breakfasts. Now, depending on where you are in the world, you might prefer the left one to the right one, depending on what you grew up with, right? So big data first came up with somebody called Trisha Wang, was doing some work on mobile phones and habits in East Asia, and translating to Western colleagues and bosses that this is not, they don't care about A, they care about B. And really kind of understanding and accepting that localized context. In the middle, I have mobile phones. And I would challenge you to think about different research questions that might come to mind with that, right? On the other side is smog, right? So how does that manifest in your research? And below are expressions of feminist protest. And again, you see that of that creativity being part of it. Any questions or points? Okay. Principle 7, make labor visible. Okay. Again, listening and learning. And who are experts and why? Now, if you're from, like, if I think of my grandmothers, they would say, what do I know? I'm not well read. That would be the first thing that they could say. But they can do more with a string than anybody that I know, right? And so thinking about who, might know land, might know contexts that we have not acknowledged and excluded forcefully. So this is important. And I think that one of the books that I really found, it was just a good read to learn about the things that have happened in the past, is Women's Work, the first, 20,000 years. Wow. And so on figure 3.2 there, it's a relief sculpture of a pregnant woman. So quite literally, it is about making labor visible and how that's expressed. Also thinking about fibers and textiles, like these are super important that perhaps we're not, if you're working in any space on trauma, for example, what we start to see is that people like to work with things that they can touch or see. So this is also something to think about, that thick data has a texture, okay? Like little things. Now, what you can do is think about equity, diversity, inclusion, and there are certain biases like God trick, for example, like if you see everything, then you don't see anything, right? So sometimes if you zoom into something, you might focus on a nuance, and don't think that because you have all the data in the world or a big Excel sheet that you're gonna get everything. Perhaps there's a more important story there. On the right-hand side is, that's an Instagram tag. So this is also about that idea of thick data and context and that texture and expression, right? So when you challenge your binaries or way of thinking, for example, right? So there's been this a strong focus on artistic data art. And so that was why I wanted to share some of these as well. And I think that for many communities that might come from second, third generation, what we start to see is that especially when it comes to non-binary identities, even things like, domestic violence, these types of more expressive platforms have been extremely important. And we've been doing some interviews with these individuals also, because you're thinking about influencers. What is an influencer? Somebody who shapes popular opinion, somebody who lives maybe through some sense of vulnerable leadership. So there's been a lot of this type of discussion as well. So a pilot principle 8 is something that we've added in the last year through our engagements with different equity, diversity, and inclusion communities, our gender communities, the accessibility and disability network as well, because your intention will differ from the impact. And for many communities that are most impacted by bias, to ask them what inclusion means, what we've seen is that we don't get a definitive answer. Many of these emotions and experiences are so heavy that you must recognize excluded perspectives as something that you're working with. Recognizing exclusion as part of your model is vital. So your scope and scale, we're going back to that image, right? Your scope and scale, how do you stretch your data, or how would you make the most of it? Those contextual dimensions. Practically speaking, how would you redesign expectations or your outcomes? And again, like I said, it's not just about the numbers, it's about the relationships between. For me, this is a model from my work. I work in a space in which I have 3 contextual knowledge domains, okay? There are different information ecosystems, and like a cake, it's layered, and I have to account for them. So we have a digital ecosystem, a technical ecosystem. In the middle, it's a semantic layer, and semantic in this case means language. For me, it would mean policy language. And if you're talking about culture change, it could be phrases like, well, this is how it's done. Right? These types of things. Like if students come and say, well, you know, these are the only readings that we're doing. That's your semantic layer, because there might be a disconnect of what's happening on the physical, on the ground, the lived experience. So when it comes to modeling those 7 and then adding that exclusion factor, it becomes really important because it allows us to at least zoom out and see how things work together. And then in that way, of course, it becomes more confusing because what's the unit of analysis? What's the impact? But for someone like me that is working on online disinformation, and we're looking at gender-based violence, to divorce them from the ground would not make any sense, right? And then again, it relies on us to acknowledge what environment dominates, whether it be systems or groups. And think through scenarios. So in this deck, there will be 2 scenarios at the end when you receive it, and they are taken from some gender-based analyses websites, and I put the links there. So they talk about cyberbullying and mining, and so you can use scenarios to think and test how you would go about those principles, right? One project that we are working in our department right now is that of a pilot around everyday data and data translation and sensory data. We often use these metaphors of a bread basket, right? That we're going to break bread together. We have this basket of tools. Now, depending on who and where you are, what you think bread is going to be very different, isn't it? But the thing is that we not only have those data feminist principles, we also have different senses. We focus in many spaces and places on, especially in the culture change space, that you write a lot. But for some communities, what we hear is that they need people just to listen and experience. And that extends beyond, writing and reading. It's about using the metaphor of bread, different types of grains, the relationship with the land. You could probably close your eyes and, those fires, when you put bread in a fire and it's really hot and you see the people and you're like, how do they do it so quick? That's expertise, right? On the bottom, I put I think it's bagels. That was one of my first jobs. And I remember the smell of that in my clothes, right? That's sensing data, right? On the right-hand side, I think if I didn't put any picture of roti, I'd get in trouble because that's my bread, if I think about it. So that's what I wanted to chat about, because this is something that is a data science project and yet is relatable. And it involves trade, it involves resource climate security, it involves many development communities as well, and especially many women that have a hard time showing labor. And that is officially the end of my slideshow, but I am happy to discuss a bit. And I once again want to just let you know that I'm learning too, and I really think that these are some principles that can help us kind of map out what we might be looking for. One thing also is that we have some people trying to play with, let's say, clusters of these principles, let's say, to operationalize. And so I do thank you all for listening. I know that you could be anywhere else, but being here was really helpful for somebody like me. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, you don't like bread, we can figure it out together. And I mean, I would just encourage, please don't worry about raising hands, just go ahead. I don't mind if you have questions. Is it shall we can start off? Hold on 1 second here. Yes, Miriam, do you have a question?
I'm gonna jump in because it's that first question that's hard.
Yeah,
hi, my name is Miriam, and I work with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities on a engaging women in local politics project. And one of the issues that we have heard from municipalities is questions around gathering data. It's not something that they do very much. And I mean, I should start by saying thank you for this presentation. I've had a lot of mind-blown moments. I think, oh, this is really exciting. But I guess my question is, what has been your experience with the receptivity of decision makers and policymakers around using data in the ways that you've described here? I don't have all the words because this is a lot new for me, but I obviously see the value of this. I think there's already a challenge for policymakers to take in, quantitative data. So just, yeah, hearing your experiences around that would be great. And any tips you might have.
Well, I think the biggest tip that I can have is stay in contact, because I think the more that we socialize and keep normalize this type of chatter, then it becomes normal. And I think that this is one of those things. Now, to answer your question, it's been a challenge. I think one of the biggest challenges is to be like, we don't have to accept, and I hate to do this, like the bro culture. We don't have to do that. It's okay, right? And again, I think one of the reasons for that is some people have a hard time saying, I don't know that. And one of the approaches and what I like about mixed teams is that I will tell you right away what I don't know. I will tell you right away that I'm a visual person, because we need to work together with our strengths. So one of the things that I do is just like that example that I had. I wonder if I can go back to it. Is these UN examples, right? So this was something that I gave as an example of why data would be important, because otherwise people will continue to do things as they would. The other thing that I find useful is to focus on translation and keeping things digestible and small, and to say that, you work with data even if you don't think you do. A spreadsheet is data, or a briefing note is data. And so starting with that. What I find also on the other side, on the dev side, is this complete lack of trust with data for the right reasons. And I think that's where these initial conversations, they inspire so much in the group, where a week later, sometimes I get messages from people, and they often end up being the gender evaluation group, that it's again, the difference in language. Sometimes evaluation teams or local groups, they just use different terms, but evaluation is assessment of a process, right? So sometimes even having a buddy system of 2 people, so they both don't know anything, and you're like, okay, you both figure it out, and they're experts. That's what I found has helped. It's better that way. And in future, and I was saying that to Alison, is that we wanted to do some, more interactive tests like that too, because that's the only way we'll learn. So I hope that answers your question. I also think certain issues are always more helpful. Climate is something, at least in some government spaces and places, becomes then what community are you connecting with? You might be connecting with, the youth networks. At least for me, that's the great space to learn from, the indigenous communities that we may connect to. But it is still early days. Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, I'd love to. And similarly, my head is kind of spinning around in a lot of different directions, but one of the things that I'm thinking about as someone who runs a center around research methodology is the process of training students, and students are still primarily trained in research methods that came out of a very limited set of people with real agendas in terms of how they designed the methods. And I think it's always interesting sort of being in these spaces where there's so much more, there's so much better, and yet you also, because this is the world that people are walking into, feel some responsibility to teach in it. And so that I almost want to call it like teaching in versus teaching through, this sort of tension around knowing that people need to understand things like the foundations of statistics, and then at the same time recognizing the challenges and the problems that exist within that framework for understanding knowledge.
Is there any other comment? Because I have something I could respond to Allison, but if there's any more, anybody else have anything, they can certainly. So just to chime into what Allison mentioned, I think definitely even my ability to be a professor of practice in a university while working in policy is indicative of some form of culture change, because you're focusing on the so what. And what that means is working with students when you have a major paper and you have to learn how to do your research. If I had to struggle to do a literature review, you can do yours, kind of thing, and kind of learning how to do these things, how to mix things. They have to do that. But then when they have to work with somebody like me, I will say that's, there's a difference between what's relevant and interesting. And I know this is your baby, but unfortunately you have 3 minutes. It's up to you, right? And it is that stringent, but again, it's about simulating scenarios that they will confront, and also sharing my experiences of being like, I've been there too, and that's the shift in the environment. One of the other things that I think is important is that, at least in the course that I help with and support around digital inclusion, and that is about data governance. We do some stuff on digital threats to democracy, disinformation, is how would you go about designing a method? And then one of my recommendations for students would be to learn while doing through maybe case studies, let's say, that can help you. The other thing is that of collaborative projects, let's say, and by collaboration, I mean with different stakeholders, not from your community, so that you can focus on what you're good at and learn from people that are good at something else. So that could be something like having a collective project in which you're collaborating. You might have a different product come out for your own goals, but you also have something that is maybe open by design, because the communities might be connected far more than you are, right? Because your community is like that. So I think that's something, and my intention with these types of theoretical approaches or frameworks is that of maybe finding a way to grow this out, because ultimately what I like about data feminism, first of all, Catherine D'Ignazio, I was able to talk to her and get some insight on how we can use this. There's also something of, I appreciate removing the focus on the group and identity. I think like that puts the burden, ultimately humans are humans. And, to recognize that we're in this moment in which, it's not about blaming anybody. We have been designed to look and think a certain way, and the systems are like that little thing in the airport. You just stand there, So let's just focus on the system through these questions of power, and come up with scenarios. So one thing that we've done also is simulations. Let's say there's like an oil spill. One group's is the oil company, the other group is an NGO, the other group are a bunch of lawyers. But you flip the script, so you might put the trade people there, so they are forced to confront. So doing that type of activity could be beneficial. Any other pressing issues? Questions? What would be one question that I have is what would be beneficial to people that, you know, even to continue this out? One thing was that of trying to come up with some interactive activities. For example, I've given color wheels to some students, and so they basically like have a circle, and then they color, you know, when they thought about power, when they thought about, you know, hierarchy, or when they really, you know, did something about emotions or whatever it may be. And then they come up with that as a final product. And I think that like that could be something that is also gets us thinking, you know, it's always about that. And I think that becomes something in terms of outcomes. And time is important, and time is not policy's friend. So that becomes, to Miriam's point, also I think in anything, like you're always running against time. So Nasreen, you can add some points, I think, because Nasreen, we've met each other in government, and I think like one of the things that I've really benefited in is people that have that much more that inclusive design, because I came from more international relations. And so go ahead, Nasreen, if you have a question or a comment.
Hi, yes, thank you so much, Dr. Kumar. This was an amazing presentation. Thank you for opening it up for all of us to kind of participate in. My my technical, like my role is an inclusive designer within the government, but similar like academic, feminist research background. One of the challenges I'm facing right now, and you know, you may not have all the answers, of course, but perhaps you have just more experience and some tips that it was really related to like what Miriam was saying. I'm finding I'm working on a project right now, collaborating with data scientists, which is wonderful, very traditional data scientists. And I'm so happy that we're able to bring, our knowledge or perspectives together, to work on a project. But, at the end of the day, our deliverable is supposed to be like a reporting dashboard, where it's very much based on like, how can we automate data, like how can we use the Excel sheets? And I'm just finding it a bit challenging navigating, I guess, translate and, but like from our kind of interviews with different groups, there's so much of that contextual, that really like thick data that you're talking about. And I'm finding it challenging as well to kind of, like promote or help, kind of senior management kind of see the value in thinking a little bit beyond, these really easy dashboards, easy in the sense that they can just take some numbers and have it all automated from someone's like Excel sheet, So I'm just wondering if this is something you've come across and how you've managed to kind of, I guess, like work with thick data to kind of senior management who just, they have like, those, they want to look at something for a minute and get an answer to know how to kind of take action. Where sometimes a lot of the analysis and the research that we work on, really takes a lot more than, those few minutes, and to kind of get into really what's happening around those kind of number kind of questions. Thank you.
This is a common challenge and cultural, like a culture clash, I think sometimes. While not on the same subject, I've had the same question in my own space. And the first thing that becomes clear in these cases is that sometimes when we look at delivery of anything, whether it be a lesson, whether it be a dashboard, in this case, dashboard, we follow what is known as a rainfall method. It's just like, here it is, here's the directions, go, and it's done. That's not the same as people understanding and using something, right? So from rainfall to DISCO method. DISCO is, again, like I'm using terms that are not government lingo, and yet they're methodologically helpful, because DISCO means you look at your data, you inquire, you speculate, you collaborate, and you're optimistic. Okay, now you're not going to go to an assistant deputy minister or somebody like that and say, you just have to DISCO. Like it's not going to work like that. But I think what you can do is on the working level, what we have found, let's say that when you, and again, time, if you can even segment models, so like let's say you made one dashboard for that delivery, and then you keep or at least cut and make another for that continuous thinking and tinkering and toying, and you give that to a policy person and you spend a half an hour, they will play with it. And again, it's situating that their opinion matters. Now, that's not the same as promoting a culture change or getting, into that director general's office. However, again, if somebody not on your team says that was really useful, thanks, you become popular too, right? So that's something that I found helpful. I had one dashboard, but then my role was saying, pause, you give that to whoever you need to, but let's play around with it a bit. And then using your cross connections to test out. So if you have networks, let's say, find something, use those fora. And that becomes the way to normalize something, doing something differently. I hope that helps.
No, that's really insightful. Thank you so much, Dr. Kumar.
What I will say to everybody, I know a lot of you said, can we keep in touch? I think I'm happy to stay in touch with everybody. If we ever wanted to reconnect, some of you doing a collaborative chat and thinking about what we could do next to even test out some of these models. And I will be sending over, I think through Allison, the deck. So I know that we're out of time, is it, Allison?
We are. I think a number of people have been having to dash off. Thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. I really believe in making things organically come together. And your questions also give me a lot to think about. Please don't hesitate to pop me a message. I'm always ready to talk and think about data. And I think that it's those intersections that we can start to crack away at. But thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I know you could be anywhere on a Friday, and I hope you have a good lunch wherever you are.
Bye, everyone.